He was 20 years old when he became king. He was 25 when he broke the mightiest empire the world had ever seen. And he was just 32 years old when he died, having never lost a single battle in his entire life. In 13 years, Alexander of Macedon conquered over 2 million square miles of territory. He marched his army more than 20,000 miles, farther than any military force before or since. He founded over 70 cities across 3 continents. But here is the question that has divided historians, philosophers, and generals for over 2,000 years. Was Alexander the Great truly great? Or was he simply the most brilliant monster history has ever produced? In 356 BC, in the royal palace of Pella, a boy was born who would shake the foundations of the ancient world. His mother was Olympias, a fierce, passionate woman from Epirus, who told her son he was descended from Achilles himself, the greatest warrior of Troy. His father was Philip II of Macedon, already a military genius who had transformed a backwater kingdom into the dominant power of Greece. From his very first breath, Alexander was told he was destined for greatness, and unlike most children told such things, he actually believed it. The legend begins early. When Alexander was around 10, a horse dealer brought a magnificent black stallion to court. The horse was unrideable. Every horseman who tried was thrown. Philip ordered it taken away, but Alexander stepped forward. Alexander had noticed Bucephalus was terrified of his own shadow. He turned the horse to face the sun, removing the shadow, spoke calmly until it stilled, then mounted and rode. When he returned, his father wept. At 13, Philip hired the greatest mind in the ancient world to educate his son, Aristotle of Stagira. For 3 years, Aristotle taught Alexander philosophy, rhetoric, medicine, and science. He gave him a lifelong passion for Homer's Iliad, a book Alexander would annotate in his own hand, carry on every campaign, and keep under his pillow beside a dagger. But education was only half his preparation. At 16, Alexander served as regent while Philip fought abroad and promptly crushed a local uprising, founding his first city on the site of his victory. He named it Alexandropolis. He was 16 years old. At 18, Alexander fought beside his father at Chaeronea, the battle that made Macedon master of Greece. He led the cavalry charge that shattered the sacred band of Thebes, 300 elite warriors, never before defeated. Alexander destroyed them completely. Greece's finest legend, broken by a teenager. Then, just as Philip was preparing the great invasion of Persia, he was assassinated at a celebration. At 20 years old, Alexander was king. His first acts were swift and ruthless. Rivals were executed. A rebellion in Thebes was crushed so completely the entire city was razed. 6,000 killed, 30,000 enslaved. Every city in Greece fell instantly into line. The message was clear. This was not Philip. This was something new. In the spring of 334 BC, Alexander crossed the Hellespont, the narrow strait dividing Europe from Asia, with roughly 37,000 soldiers. Against him stood the Persian Empire, the largest empire in world history, stretching from Greece to India, commanded by Darius III with armies 10 times his size. Before landing, Alexander hurled his spear into the Asian soil, claiming the continent won by the spear. He was the first man ashore. His first battle at the Granicus River nearly ended everything. Alexander led the cavalry personally into the thickest fighting. 2 commanders converged on him simultaneously. One's blade shattered on his helmet, and before the second could strike, his general Clytus severed the attacker's arm. Alexander survived by inches. He was also grinning when it was over. He would fight like this, in the front line, personally, for the next 13 years. His generals begged him to stop. He never did. City after city surrendered or defected. At Gordium, Alexander encountered the famous Gordian knot, a massively complex knot prophesied to be undone only by the future ruler of Asia. Alexander examined it briefly, then drew his sword and cut straight through it. Whether legend or history, the story captures something essential. Alexander did not compete inside the rules of the game. He rewrote the rules entirely. In November 333 BC, Darius III had enough. He marched west himself with a colossal army to destroy Alexander personally. They met at Issus, a narrow coastal plain where mountains met the sea, and where Persia's enormous numerical advantage was neutralized by the terrain. It was exactly the ground Alexander wanted. The phalanx advanced, a bristling steel hedge of 18-foot sarissa spears. On the right flank, Alexander led the companion cavalry on a diagonal angle, hunting for the gap between the Persian left and the sea. When he found it, he struck with devastating speed. His cavalry crashed through the Persian flank and drove straight toward the royal command post, toward Darius himself. What happened next would haunt Persia forever. Darius, king of kings, ruler of the greatest empire on earth, turned his chariot and fled.
We must break free!
His army, seeing their king abandon them, collapsed in a catastrophic rout. The Persian camp was overrun, and inside it, Alexander found something unexpected. Darius's mother, wife, and daughters, the entire royal family, left behind in the flight. Alexander's response was immediate. He guaranteed their safety, addressed Darius's mother as queen, and told her Darius was still alive. He treated them with complete royal dignity for the rest of his campaign. His was not mere chivalry, it was brilliant statecraft. Alexander was not just conquering Persia, he was becoming its legitimate ruler. After Issus, Alexander turned south instead of chasing Darius. His goal: cut off the Persian navy from its ports and secure Egypt. The island city of Tyre refused to yield. Alexander's answer was extraordinary. He built a stone causeway through the sea, half a mile long, and stormed the city from land. 7 months of brutal engineering and combat. When Tyre fell, 8,000 were killed. 30,000 were enslaved. The message was delivered in stone and blood. Egypt had despised Persian rule. They welcomed Alexander as a liberator. The priests declared him pharaoh, son of the god Amun. But Alexander wanted more than a title. He made a journey few rulers would attempt. 1,000 miles into the western desert, to the oracle of Amun at Siwa. The march nearly killed his army with thirst and heat. When he emerged from the oracle's inner sanctum, he told no one what he had been told. From that moment, Alexander began to believe, truly believe, not as a political maneuver, but as personal conviction, that he was the literal son of a god. This belief would shape every decision that followed, the risks he took, the boundaries he crossed, and the demands he made of his men and his empire. Before leaving Egypt, he founded a new city at the Nile Delta, one that would become the world's greatest center of learning for 7 centuries. He called it Alexandria. Darius had learned from Issus. This time he chose wide-open flatlands where Persia's overwhelming numbers could envelop the Macedonians from all sides. He leveled the ground for his chariots. He brought war elephants, animals Alexander's army had never faced. He arranged his force in a front line stretching well beyond the reach of Alexander's flanks. The night before the battle, Alexander's generals urged a night attack to reduce the odds. Alexander refused. While his generals kept watch, Alexander slept soundly until dawn. He needed his mind clear for what was coming. What followed was one of the greatest tactical performances in the history of warfare. Alexander deliberately angled his advance to the right, drawing the Persian left cavalry to pursue, stretching their line, pulling it apart. When the gap appeared at the seam between Persian units, Alexander personally led the companion cavalry straight through it, like a spear thrown at the heart of the empire. He drove directly for Darius. Again, Darius fled. Again, the Persian army, seeing their king abandon the field, collapsed into chaos. Babylon surrendered without a fight. Susa fell. Persepolis, the ceremonial heart of the Persian Empire, filled with centuries of accumulated treasure, was taken, and then, in a night of celebration that Alexander later claimed to regret, burned. Darius fled east, only to be murdered by one of his own nobles. When Alexander found his body, he removed his own cloak and laid it over the fallen king. The greatest empire in history was over. Alexander was 25 years old, but Alexander would not stop. His men were exhausted. His generals reasoned with him. He kept marching east into the mountains of Central Asia, fighting the most grinding campaigns of his career against guerrilla enemies who refused open battle. He was struck in the chest by an arrow. Another pierced his lung. At the siege of Multan, he jumped alone over the walls of a defended city, surrounded, and was fighting alone before his guards forced their way in after him. At the Hydaspes River in India, Alexander faced his most formidable opponent, King Porus, commanding war elephants that had never been part of any war his soldiers had trained for. In a brilliant night river crossing and a complex envelopment, Alexander won his last great pitched battle. When a wounded Porus was brought before him, Alexander asked how he wished to be treated. Alexander was so impressed that he restored Porus's kingdom and expanded it. But then, for the first and only time, Alexander's army told him no. They had marched for 8 years. They were 20,000 miles from home. They had crossed deserts, mountains, and rivers. They were done. Their officers wept when they delivered the news. Alexander waited, hoping they would change their minds. They didn't. He turned back. For the first time in his life, the world had stopped him. The return was a catastrophe. Through the Gedrosian Desert, Alexander lost perhaps a quarter of his remaining army to thirst, heat, and starvation. Not in battle, but in the attempt to prove he could do what others had failed to do. Back in Babylon in 323 BC, he was already planning his next campaign, the conquest of Arabia, when he attended a banquet, drank heavily, and fell suddenly ill with a fever. Over the next 11 days, he grew weaker. He was unable to speak in his final days. His soldiers were allowed to file past his bed to see him one last time. He could no longer raise his head, but he acknowledged each one with his eyes. When his generals finally asked who would inherit his empire, he gave his last recorded words, "To the strongest." He was 32 years old. Within 20 years, his empire had shattered. His family was destroyed in the wars that followed. The man who had conquered the world left behind no lasting political structure. And yet, his legacy was total. The Greek language and culture spread across the Middle East and Central Asia for centuries. The city of Alexandria became the world's greatest center of learning. He reshaped trade routes, cities, and civilizations. So, was he great or monstrous? A liberator or a destroyer? A visionary king or a man consumed by ambition? The answer, perhaps, is that he was all of these things at once. And that is why, more than 2,000 years later, we are still telling his story. Perhaps that, more than any empire he built or any battle he won, is his greatest conquest of all.